Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are clearing off the desk, pushing aside the clutter, and focusing on a singular, massive figure. And when I say massive, I don't just mean he wrote a lot of books, though. I mean, he certainly did that.
Oh, you did?
We are talking about someone who stands like a colossus over the intellectual landscape of the entire 20th century.
It is a pleasure to be here.
Wow.
And colossus is absolutely the right word. We're talking about Octavio Paz.
Yes.
And, to simply call him a writer feels like a drastic underselling of what he actually was.
Right, because when I started digging into this stack of research, the biographies and Nobel citations, the literary criticism, it felt less like reading about a man and more like reading a history of the world from 1914 to 1998.
That's a great way to put it. He wasn't just an observer. He was in the room where it happened again and again.
He was a participant.
Exactly. He is the prism through which we can view the Mexican Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, the rise of surrealism in Paris, the post-colonial shifts in India, and of course the fall of Soviet communism.
He's a poet, a diplomat, a philosopher, and a political polemicist who, and this is key, managed to irritate just about everyone at some point.
He really did.
Because he refused to stay in a neat little box.
That's the hook for me, too. I think the mission of this deep dive isn't just to list his books or his awards.
No.
It's to try and figure out how one human brain managed to synthesize things that seem totally contradictory.
I mean, we're talking about a guy who blended Marxist revolution with Aztec circular time and then mixed in French surrealism with Buddhist silence.
Right. How do you even begin to mix those ingredients? It sounds like a recipe for chaos, doesn't it?
It does. But in Paz, it became this singular, powerful voice.
It did. And as the sources point out, his life's work was essentially a dual project, explaining Mexico to the world and the world to Mexico.
Which is a tall order, a very tall order.
It is. The critic Ilan Stavens, his biography is excellent, referred to Paz as the quintessential surveyor. I like that.
Surveyor.
And also a Dante's Virgil. He was a guide. He was a Renaissance man in an era of specialists. While everyone else was narrowing their focus, Paz was just constantly widening his.
So we have a long road ahead of us today. We're going to map this out chronologically because his life really does build on itself, kind of like layers of sediment.
That's the only way to do it.
We'll start with his origins, which, spoiler alert, are incredibly dramatic, then move to his awakening as a young radical.
Right. Then we'll cover his time as a diplomat in Paris, and that's when he writes his masterpiece, The Labyrinth of Solitude.
Then we have to go east. We'll talk about his transformative years in India, which leads directly to the trauma of 1968 and his resignation from the diplomatic corps.
A huge moment. And finally, we have to wade into the messy, heated waters of his political life, where he made enemies on both the left and the right before we can even get to his Nobel legacy.
It's a journey from the library to the battlefield and, in many ways, back again.
So where do we start?
Let's jump right into part one. The Visigoth and the Revolution. When I was reading about his childhood, I just kept thinking, this house must have been the most tense place on earth for a holiday dinner.
You are probably not wrong. To understand Paz, you have to understand that he was born literally into the fire.
1914.
Exactly. The Mexican Revolution is tearing the country apart. But the conflict wasn't just outside his window. It was, inside his living room. It was in his blood.
Let's break down the family tree because this is just fascinating. You have these two dominant male figures in his life, and they represent completely opposing versions of Mexico.
Precisely. On one side, you have the grandfather, Ireneo Paz,
A patriarch.
the patriarch of the household where Octavio grew up. Ireneo was a formidable man, a journalist, a liberal intellectual, a novelist. He had fought against the French intervention in the mid-19th century, a real liberal hero of his time.
But by the time Octavio is born, Ireneo has sort of settled. He's become a staunch supporter of the establishment.
And specifically, he was a supporter of Porfirio Diaz.
Okay, so for the listener who might need a quick refresher, Porfirio Diaz was the president, and I'm using air quotes here, basically the dictator who ruled Mexico for over 30 years.
The Porfiriato.
Right. His regime was all about order, progress, European-style modernization.
And keeping the indigenous population firmly under control. He represented the European civilized face of Mexico.
So the grandfather stands for order, tradition, and the Eurocentric elite.
Correct. Now, you contrast that with Octavio's father, Octavio Paz,
who goes in the complete opposite direction.
radically opposite. The father wasn't just a sympathizer with the revolution.
No, he was in it.
He was an active agent for Emiliano Zapata.
Zapata. I mean, that's the legendary revolutionary of the South, the man fighting for land and liberty, fighting specifically against the class of people that the grandfather supported.
Exactly. The father was a lawyer for the Zapatistas. He was involved in agrarian reform, trying to get land back to the peasants. He was often absent, riding with the revolutionaries, drinking, fighting.
A chaotic figure.
A very chaotic figure. His life was turbulent and violent, and he eventually died a violent death. He was run over by a train, heavily influenced by alcohol. A tragic, chaotic end.
So you have the grandfather, order, books, European culture, and the father. Revolution, guns, indigenous rights, chaos.
Young Octavio is stuck right in the middle of that.
Literally.
He is the synthesis of that conflict. He's living in his grandfather's house in Mixcoac, which was just a village then. Now it's a bustling part of Mexico City. And the house itself is this crumbling mansion, almost a symbol of the old order falling apart.
And because the father was away so much fighting the revolution,
The grandfather became the primary father figure. He was the one who was there day in and day out.
there is a story in Enrique Krause's biography that I think we have to tell because it just visualizes this identity crisis so perfectly. It's the Visigoth story.
It's a classic anecdote. It tells you everything you need to know.
So set the scene for us.
Okay, so imagine the scene. The father, the Zapatista, comes home for a visit. And he brings some of his revolutionary comrades with him.
These are not the grandfather's friends.
Not at all. These are hardened men, campesinos, wearing sombreros, carrying rifles. They're, the true face of the Mexican earth. They're dusty, they're weathered.
And then runs in little Octavio.
Yes. And Octavio, interestingly, took after his mother's side of the family physically. He had light skin, fair hair, and piercing blue eyes.
He didn't look like the revolutionaries his father was with.
He looked like the landowners they were fighting against. So one of the revolutionaries, a man named Antonio Diaz Soto y Gama, who was a serious intellectual of the movement, not just some random soldier, he sees this blue-eyed kid and is just shocked.
What does he say?
He looks at Octavio's father and shouts, "Caramba, you didn't tell me you had a Visigoth for a son."
A Visigoth! Wow! That is such a loaded word.
It's incredibly heavy. I mean, think about it. The Visigoths were the Germanic tribes that invaded Spain.
So in the Mexican context, calling someone a Visigoth is emphasizing their whiteness, their foreignness.
Their role as the conqueror.
It's saying, you are not one of us.
You are the other. You are the invader. Imagine hearing that as a child. Your dad is fighting for the people, but the people look at you and see the enemy.
It must have left a deep, deep scar.
It did. Paz later wrote about this feeling of exclusion. He said, and this is a quote that's just heartbreaking, "I felt myself Mexican, but they wouldn't let me be one."
Wow.
That one sentence, it sets up a lifelong struggle. How can I be Mexican if I don't look Mexican? What does it even mean to be Mexican? Is it blood? Is it culture? Is it a choice? Is it history?
And since he couldn't find a sense of belonging in the faces of the people around him, he went looking for it somewhere else.
He went to the library.
The grandfather's library.
Yes. This is really the third character in his childhood. His grandfather, his father, and the library. It was this massive room filled with thousands of books, classic Mexican history, French novels, Spanish poetry, everything.
I love the image of this kid while the country is literally exploding in revolution outside the walls, just sitting there in the dust, devouring books.
It's a complete refuge. It was his cave. It was the one place that made sense.
And it's important to note what he was reading. It wasn't just random stuff.
No, he was very deliberate. In the 1920s, as a teenager, he discovered the Spanish poets of the generation of 27 and the generation of 98.
Writers like Gerardo Diego, Juan Ramon Jimenez, Antonio Machado.
Yes. And why were they so important to him?
Tell us.
Because these were writers who were reinventing the Spanish language. They were modernists. They were trying to strip away the flowery, pompous 19th century style.
They wanted to find a pure poetry.
A pure poetry. They were showing him that language could be a tool to explore reality, to cut through the noise, not just to decorate it. And for a boy trying to figure out his own reality, that was a powerful idea.
And he didn't wait around for permission to join the conversation. I mean, he started publishing incredibly young.
Extremely young. Almost unnervingly so. He published his first poem, Caballera, in 1931 when he was 17.
17.
By 18, he founded a literary review called Barandal. At 19, he published his first collection of poems, Luna Silvestre, Wild Moon.
19. At 19, I was primarily concerned with where to get pizza. He's founding literary journals.
It's a different level of precociousness. But there's a specific essay he wrote even earlier at 16 called Ethics of the Artist that really caught my eye. It sounds way too mature for a teenager.
Right. What's he grappling with in that?
He's already exploring the central tension of his life. The tension between pure art, art for beauty's sake, and social art. Art that serves a political purpose.
Art of thesis.
Art of thesis, exactly. And what's fascinating is the language he uses. It's a strange mix of religious and Marxist vocabulary. He's already asking, does the poet have a duty to the revolution? Or is his only duty to the poem itself?
A question he would spend the next 60 years trying to answer.
And that is the perfect segue to part 2, awakening and disillusionment. Because that theoretical question, what is the duty of the artist, was about to get very, very practical for him.
Okay, so the timeline here is the mid-1930s.
Indeed. It's 1936. Paz is studying law at the National University of Mexico. He's on the track to be a typical member of the elite, a bureaucrat, or a politician. But he feels this pull.
The pull of his father's world.
To do something real. To connect with the Mexico that he was told he didn't belong to. He felt like a fraud, studying law while the country was still dealing with the fallout of the revolution.
So he drops out.
He abandons his studies and moves to the Yucatan, specifically to the city of Mérida. He takes a job at a school founded by President Lázaro Cárdenas for the sons of workers and peasants.
The Yucatan in the 1930s was not a tourist destination. I mean, it was rough.
It was a different world, a different country almost. The economy there was driven by Henneken sisal, the fiber used for rope.
And it was a brutal industry.
Brutal. The indigenous Maya workers were living in conditions that were barely a step up from slavery. They were beholden to the landowners, trapped in a system of debt peonage. They were born in debt. They died in debt.
So Paz, the bookish, blue-eyed poet from the capital, is suddenly confronted with the raw, grinding poverty of the rural South.
And it shocks him to his core. It radicalizes him, but it also inspires him poetically. It gives him a subject.
This is where he writes a long poem called Entre la piedra y la flor.
Between the stone and the flower, yes.
I've seen this poem described as his first major work. What's going on in it? Why is it so important?
It's fascinating because you see the influence of T.S. Eliot. Paz had read The Wasteland, and it just blew him away. He takes Eliot's modernist techniques, the fragmentation, the shifting voices, the bleak imagery, the despair, and he applies them to the Mexican Henneken fields.
So he's not writing a folk ballad?
No, not at all. He's describing the peasant's life not with romantic folk songs, but with jagged, difficult, high modernist imagery. He's basically saying, this suffering is not some quaint, timeless thing. This is modern. This is part of the 20th century wasteland.
So he's finding his voice. He's blending the social concern of his father with the high literary culture of his grandfather.
He's forging the synthesis. And then, just as he's doing that, the world calls. The Spanish Civil War breaks out.
1937. This is the defining moment for his generation of intellectuals, globally.
It was the last great cause. It was a clear-cut battle, or so it seemed. The democratically elected Republican government of Spain was being attacked by General Franco's fascists,
who were being openly backed by Hitler and Mussolini.
So the line seemed very clear. It was democracy versus fascism. And the intellectuals of the world flocked to Spain to support the Republic.
It becomes this romantic, heroic cause.
It does. And Paz goes to Spain for the Second International Writers' Congress. And the roster of attendees is just insane.
Just a who's who.
Andre Malraux, Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Neruda, Langston Hughes, Stephen Spender, they're all there.
It sounds like the most intimidating cocktail party in history, and it's happening in a war zone.
It was incredibly heady. Paz was the youngest delegate. He was treated as a sort of mascot or little brother by people like Neruda. He was swept up in the romanticism of it all.
But while the public face of the Congress was all about unity against fascism, the reality on the ground was much, much darker.
And this is where the disillusionment part of this chapter hits hard.
Yes.
The Republican side was a very fragile coalition. Democrats, socialists, anarchists, and communists. But the Soviet Union was the only major power sending weapons to the Republic. So the Stalinist communists were gaining more and more control.
And they weren't just fighting fascists.
No. They were purging their own allies. Anyone who didn't toe the Moscow line anarchists, Trotskyists, independent leftists was a target.
A friendly fire.
Or not so friendly fire. And Paz experienced this personally. He discovered that a friend of his, Jose Robles, had disappeared.
He was a leftist, right?
Absolutely. Robles wasn't a fascist. He was a leftist academic. But he had disagreed with the Soviet advisors. Paz started asking questions, and he learned the horrifying truth. Robles had been murdered, executed by the Stalinist secret police.
That moment seems to be the pivot point for his entire political life. It's the original sin for him.
It is the absolute key. It's the moment he realized that a regime could claim to be for the people, could use the language of the left, and still be a murderous totalitarian state.
And evil wasn't exclusive to the right.
Exactly. He saw that the dogma of communism could be just as repressive, just as violent as the dogma of the church or the fascists. He didn't stop being a man of the left immediately, not by a long shot, but he lost his faith in the party. He realized that the revolution could eat its own children.
He keeps that doubt tucked away, though, for a while. And on his way back to Mexico, he stops in Paris.
Yes. And if Spain gave him a dose of hard, ugly reality, Paris gave him a dose of the unreal.
Surrealism. He meets the surrealists, André Breton and the others, and this just changes his aesthetic DNA.
Completely.
So for the listener who might just think surrealism equals melting clocks, what did it mean to Paz? Why was it so important?
It wasn't just an art style for them, it was a moral philosophy. It was a way of life. The surrealists believed that Western rationalism, logic, capitalism, rigid order had led the world directly into the slaughter of World War I.
They saw reason as a trap.
As a death trap. They wanted to liberate the human mind. They wanted to access the subconscious, the dream state, the irrational, the marvelous. They saw poetry in the chance encounter, in the absurd.
So for Paz, surrealism was a form of freedom, a different kind of revolution.
Precisely. It was a tool to break the masks of society, to get to a deeper reality.
Yeah.
When he returned to Mexico in 1938, he co-founded a journal called Taller, which means workshop.
And what was the goal of Taller?
He wanted to bring this new vitality to Mexican literature. He wanted to merge the political revolution, the fight for social justice, with this surrealist revolution, the fight for spiritual and psychological freedom.
And we should mention his personal life here, because he wasn't alone in this journey. He married Elena Garro in 1937, right before they went to Spain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Elena Garro. We could do a whole separate deep dive on her. She is arguably Mexico's greatest female novelist of the century, a genius in her own right.
They met at university.
Yes, they went to Spain together.
Yeah.
But their marriage was, let's call it combustible.
Two geniuses in a small house. That sounds like a recipe for drama.
It was. It was fraught with professional jealousy, infidelity, and intense passion. They had a daughter, Helena, but the marriage eventually collapsed under the weight of their two massive intellects and egos. They divorced in 1959.
But in these early years, they were a real power couple, intellectually inseparable, even if they were emotionally volatile.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move to part 3, the diplomat and the labyrinth. Because now Paz enters the phase where he becomes, for many, the national voice.
Right. The story moves forward. In 1943, he gets a Guggenheim Fellowship and goes to the U.S., specifically to UC Berkeley.
This is his first real immersion in the United States, and like so many exiles and writers, being away from home allowed him to see his home more clearly.
He gives you perspective. He's looking at the Puchos, the Mexican-American youths in Los Angeles, with their zoot suits and their defiant slang, their unique culture. He's fascinated by them. They're not quite Mexican, not quite American. There's something new.
Another identity crisis.
Another identity crisis, exactly. And then, in 1945, a major career shift. He joins the Mexican diplomatic service.
He gets posted to Paris, and it's there, sitting in a cafe in post-war Paris, surrounded by existentialists and surrealists, that he writes the book that defines him.
The Labyrinth of Solitude.
If you read only one book by Paz, this is it.
This is the one. Published in 1950, it is a collection of essays, but really it is a psychoanalysis of the entire Mexican nation.
That is such a bold, almost arrogant concept, to psychoanalyze a whole country. What was his diagnosis?
He starts with a simple question. Why is the Mexican character defined by solitude? Why is there this wall, this distance? And he introduces the central concept of the mask.
Let's unpack the mask. What is it?
Paz argues that the Mexican is an instinctive nihilist who hides behind a mask of indifference and ceremoniousness, a mask of stoicism.
Okay.
He says that in Mexican culture, to open up, to show your true feelings is to be weak, to be vulnerable. The ideal of manliness, machismo, is to be closed, invulnerable, impenetrable, never crack.
And where does this come from?
He traces it all the way back to the conquest, and he uses a very specific, very vulgar verb to explain this history, doesn't he?
He does. The verb chingar.
Chingar.
Yeah.
It implies violence, violation, aggression, domination. He says the entire history of Mexico can be understood through this one word.
And he connects it directly to the foundational story of Mexico.
Yes. He talks about La Malinche, the indigenous woman who's Hernan Cortez's translator and mistress. For centuries, she was seen as a traitor. But Paz sees her as the symbolic mother of Mexico. He calls her La Chingada, the violated one, the opened one.
This is heavy, heavy stuff. He's saying that the modern Mexican is the product of a historical violation. The Spanish father, who is El Chingon, the violator, and the indigenous mother, who is La Chingada.
Exactly. And because of that foundational trauma, the Mexican feels illegitimate. He's an orphan. He rejects the Spanish father, the invader, but he also feels a kind of shame for the indigenous mother, the one who was violated.
So he is left alone, suspended between two worlds belonging to neither.
And so he builds a shell, a labyrinth of solitude, to protect his fragile inner self. He wears the mask.
Wow. That is such a powerful, if incredibly bleak way to look at a national identity.
It was seismic. It was a bombshell. It gave Mexicans a language to talk about their own history that wasn't just dates and battles. It was psychological. It was poetic.
And it influenced everyone who came after him.
Everyone. Carlos Fuentes, for example.
Yeah.
You can't understand the Latin American literary boom of the 60s without understanding that Labyrinth of Solitude laid the intellectual groundwork. It became the handbook for understanding Mexico.
But Paz wasn't just writing essays. His poetry was becoming just as ambitious. In the mid-50s, he travels to India and Japan as a diplomat, and then returns to Mexico City in 1954. And this is when he writes Piedra de Sol, Sunstone.
His poetic masterpiece. If Labyrinth is his great work of prose, Sunstone is his great work of poetry. Published in 1957, it is one single long poem, 584 lines.
And that number, 584, is not random.
Not at all. It is precise. It corresponds to the synodic period of the planet Venus in the Aztec calendar. Venus, the morning and evening star, was incredibly important to them.
So the structure of the poem itself is rooted in pre-Columbian cosmology.
Deeply. And the poem is circular. The last 6 lines of the poem are identical to the first 6 lines.
So the poem is a loop. It never ends.
Exactly. It mimics the Aztec concept of time, which is cyclical, not linear like Western time. A snake eating its own tail.
But the content of the poem isn't about Aztec gods.
No, the content is pure surrealism. It's a torrent of images about memory, eroticism, the female body, the Spanish Civil War, modern life. He's fusing the ancient Aztec structure with a modern European surrealist consciousness.
It's the ultimate expression of that Renaissance man synthesis we talked about at the beginning.
It truly is.
So by the late 50s, he is an undisputed star. He has written the definitive essay on Mexico and the definitive poem, but his career as a diplomat is about to take him to a place that will change his soul.
And that brings us to part 4, the Eastern Slope.
In 1962, Paz is appointed the Mexican ambassador to India.
And this wasn't just another posting for him, another cushy job.
Yeah.
He fell in love with India. He stayed for 6 years, and this period marks a distinct shift in his thinking and his poetry.
How so? If Paris was about surrealism and the anxiety of history,
India was about Buddhism and the search for presence, for the now.
how did that show up in his writing?
He began to move away from the obsession with history and identity that defined Labyrinth. In Buddhist philosophy, the self is an illusion. History is an illusion. The only thing that is real is the present moment, this instant.
So he's letting go of that past trauma?
He's trying to. He wrote books like The Monkey Grammarian and the poetry collection Ladera Este, Eastern Slope. His poetry became more visual, more contemplative, less frantic than his surrealist work, more about silence.
He also found a new community there, right?
He did. He connected with the hungry generation of writers in India. These were young, anti-establishment poets in Bengal who were challenging the caste system and the literary elite.
So even as an ambassador in a suit, he still had that revolutionary smirk.
He felt a kinship with these rebels. He saw them as doing in India what the surrealists had tried to do in Paris.
And crucially, on a personal level, he met his second wife there.
Marie-José Tremeni, a French artist. They met in 1965. This was the great love of his life.
She was his partner until his death.
Yes. He wrote incredible, luminous, erotic poetry for her. She gave him a stability and a happiness that he hadn't really known before. Their partnership was central to the second half of his life.
So he's happy, he's highly respected, he's the ambassador, he's found love and a new spiritual path. Things are good. But then comes 1968.
The year the world caught fire.
It's hard to overstate how intense 1968 was globally. You have the student riots in Paris, the Prague Spring, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in the U.S.
And in Mexico City, the Olympics are about to begin.
Right. The government of Mexico, which for decades had been ruled by the single-party state of the PRI.
The Institutional Revolutionary Party, a perfect oxymoron.
They wanted to use the Olympics to show the world that Mexico is a modern, stable, first-world country. A success story.
But Mexican students were in the streets. They were part of that Global 68 movement. They were protesting the authoritarian nature of the government. They wanted real democracy, not the PRI's facade.
The government was terrified of being embarrassed on the global stage. So on October 2nd, just 10 days before the opening ceremonies, they made a horrific decision.
The Tlatelolco massacre.
Mm.
The army surrounded a massive, peaceful student demonstration at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. They opened fire, snipers on the rooftops, soldiers on the ground.
We still don't know the exact death toll, but it was in the hundreds. Men, women, children.
And the government immediately tried to cover it up, claiming the students fired first. But everyone knew it was a lie. It was a state-sponsored slaughter.
Paz is in New Delhi. He hears about this. He is the official representative of that government.
Imagine the moral dilemma. He has reached the pinnacle of his career. He's an ambassador. But the government paying his salary has just slaughtered its own children. The very people, the students, that Paz had championed in his youth.
So he does something that almost no one in the Mexican system ever did. He quits.
He resigns in protest. And you have to understand, in the PRI system of the time, loyalty was everything. Resigning wasn't just quitting a job. It was a profound political act of defiance.
It was burning a bridge that could never be rebuilt.
He was blacklisted. He saved his moral integrity, but he lost his position, his status. He became a hero to the students and the intellectual class. He proved, when it counted, that he wasn't a sellout.
So he leaves India, he spends some time teaching at Cambridge and Harvard and other places in the U.S., and then he returns to Mexico in 1969.
But he can't go back to being a diplomat. He can't work for the government. He needs a new vehicle for his ideas.
This begins the magazine era.
Yes. He realized that if he couldn't shape politics from the inside, he would shape culture from the outside. He founded the magazine Plural in 1970.
And when the government, in a roundabout way, shut that down.
He wasn't deterred. He immediately founded Vuelta in 1976. And Vuelta became the most important intellectual magazine in the entire Spanish-speaking world for the next 20 years.
It was his fortress, his platform.
But this fortress is where he started launching attacks that confused and angered a lot of people.
Which brings us to part 5, political thought, the slippery ideology.
Slippery is the perfect word. The critic Yvonne Grenier said Paz was very slippery for anyone thinking in rigid ideological categories.
And as he got older, he just refused to fit into the binary of left versus right.
Okay, so let's explain the context. In the 1970s and 80s, the Latin American left was surging. You had Fidel Castro firmly empowering Cuba. You had the Sandinistas overthrowing the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua.
And the intellectual class in Mexico and across Latin America was largely united in supporting these revolutions. They were seen as the great hope against U.S. imperialism.
And Paz, the man who resigned to protest a right-wing government's massacre, stood up and said, wait a minute.
Because he remembered Spain.
He never forgot Spain. He saw the seeds of Stalinism in these new revolutions. He started publishing articles in Volta, criticizing Castro's human rights record, the lack of free speech, the political prisoners.
He exposed the dark side of the Cuban Revolution when it was very unfashionable to do so.
Very. And he did the same with Nicaragua. While everyone else was cheering the Sandinistas, he was criticizing their censorship of the press and their growing authoritarianism.
And the reaction from the left was not polite.
It was vitriolic. You have to understand, criticizing Fidel Castro in a Mexican university in the 1970s was like swearing in church. It was heresy.
So what do they call him?
A traitor, a reactionary, a friend of Ronald Reagan, a CIA agent, a sellout. Students who had cheered him in '68 were now burning effigies of him outside the U.S. Embassy.
And this political rift destroyed his most famous friendship, the feud with Carlos Fuentes.
A true tragedy. Carlos Fuentes and Octavio Paz were the two towers of Mexican literature. They were best friends for decades.
But Fuentes was a staunch supporter of the Sandinistas.
A passionate supporter. Paz saw the Sandinistas as budding totalitarians. The rift grew and grew, and then the final straw. Paz allowed a brutal critique of Fuentes to be published in Vuelta.
Written by his protege, Enrique Krauss.
Yes. The article tore Fuentes apart, calling him a guerrilla dandy, basically accusing him of being a champagne socialist who romanticized revolutions from his comfortable apartment.
And Fuentes felt betrayed that Paz, his friend, would publish something so personal and vicious.
He did. They stopped speaking. They never reconciled. It's one of the great tragedies of literature two giants who let politics kill their friendship.
But Paz's core point was consistent, right? He was simply anti-totalitarian from any direction.
Consistent to a fault.
Yeah.
He was influenced by people like Albert Camus and George Orwell. He believed that a dictatorship is a dictatorship, whether the dictator wears a right-wing military uniform or a left-wing Che Guevara t-shirt.
He valued freedom above revolution.
And for many on the left, that was an unforgivable sin.
He also took a nuanced and for many a controversial stance on the Spanish conquest that angered people.
Yes. He pushed back against the black legend, the idea that the Spanish were just evil monsters who destroyed a paradise.
He didn't deny the violence.
Not at all. He acknowledged the brutality, but he argued that the conquest also brought things like the rule of law, the Spanish language, and a connection to Western culture that, for better or worse, unify the disparate peoples of the region. He said that without the Spanish influence, Mexico would just be a fractured collection of warring tribes.
Which many on the left felt was an apology for colonialism.
They saw it as him siding with the conquerors.
And then the final painful irony, 1994, the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, the Easy Ellen.
History rhymes, doesn't it? Paz is an old man now, in his 80s. Suddenly, an army of indigenous peasants rises up in the south, led by a charismatic, pipe-smoking figure, Subcomandante Marcos, demanding land and rights. And they call themselves Zapatistas.
His father was a Zapatista. You'd think Paz, of all people, would be thrilled.
But he wasn't. He criticized the uprising. He felt that in a modern democracy, which Mexico was, however, imperfectly trying to become, violence was not the answer.
He believed in ballots, not bullets.
By that point, yes. He even signed an open letter supporting the government's use of military force to restore order.
The son of the Zapatistas supporting the army against the new Zapatistas, that is a complicated legacy.
It is. Many people never forgave him for that. They saw it as the final proof that he had become a conservative old man. But Paz would argue he was defending the fragile institution of democracy against the chaos of armed rebellion.
He did get one moment of pure vindication, though. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Yes. In 1990, just after communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, he organized a massive conference in Mexico City called The Experience of Freedom.
He invited intellectuals from all over the world.
Queso Míos, Mario Vargas Llosa, dissidents from the former Soviet bloc. It was his victory lap. He'd been warning about Soviet totalitarianism for 50 years, while his critics called him a reactionary, and he lived to see it crumble.
It's a powerful moment. But before we close the book on him, we need to remember that underneath all the political fighting, he was an artist.
We can't lose sight of the poetry.
Part 6. Aesthetics, Poetry, and Themes.
The critic Ramon Girau said, Paz's poetry leads into the realm of silence where true language lives.
Okay, that sounds beautiful, but what does it mean?
It means that for Paz, poetry wasn't just about stringing together pretty words. It was about creating a space, a moment of intensity, where the reader could experience otherness, the other person, the other time, the other reality.
And what were his big recurring themes?
Love and eroticism were absolutely paramount. Paz believed that the erotic act, true union with another person, was the one moment where humans could step outside of time, outside of history.
It's a rebellion.
It's a revolutionary act against the machine of society. When you are truly in love, time stops. You aren't a worker or a voter or a citizen. You are just a being in the present moment.
He was also obsessed with the visual arts.
A huge fan of modern art. He wrote brilliant essays on Marcel Duchamp and Joan Moreau. He saw a deep connection between the visual image and the written word. He treated poems almost like verbal sculptures.
And we have to mention his huge work on Sor Juana, The Traps of Faith.
A monumental biography, a masterpiece of historical scholarship. So Juana Inés de la Cruz was a 17th century nun in colonial Mexico.
And she was a genius.
An absolute genius.
Yeah.
A mathematician, a theologian, a playwright, a poet, a feminist before the word even existed. But the Inquisition and the church silenced her. They saw her intelligence as a threat and forced her to give up her books and her studies.
And Paz saw his own reflection in her.
Completely. She was the intellectual trying to survive and create in an authoritarian, dogmatic world. Writing that book was his way of honoring the long lineage of Mexican thought and resistance.
And finally, Part 7, Recognition and Legacy. After decades of being a controversial figure, the world finally gave him his due.
The awards started piling up in the 80s. The Miguel de Cervantes Prize in 1981, which is like the Nobel for the Spanish-speaking world.
The Neustadt International Prize in 1982. And then the big one.
1990. The Nobel Prize in Literature.
The first and still the only Mexican writer to win it.
In his acceptance speech, he spoke beautifully about his lifelong search for the present. It was the perfect culmination of a life spent bridging gaps between Mexico and the world, between East and West, between the pre-Columbian past and the modern future.
He died in 1998 in Mexico City.
From cancer. He was given a state funeral. His ashes are kept at the Colegio de San Ildefonso, the very building where he went to high school, and the birthplace of the Mexican muralist movement. In the end, he returned to the center.
So let's wrap this up. We've unpacked the Visigoth, the Zapatista's son, the surrealist, the diplomat, the critic. What does this all mean for us? Why should a listener today care about Octavio Paz?
I think for me it comes back to the mask.
From the Labyrinth of Solitude.
Yes. We are living in a time where identity is everything, yet we often feel more isolated than ever. We curate our lives on social media. We build our own digital masks. Paz teaches us that this feeling of solitude is part of the modern human condition. But he also shows us the way out. Connection, love, eroticism, but also conversation and criticism. He teaches us that we don't have to be just one thing. You can be proud of your roots and be a citizen of the world. You can be a fierce critic of your own side. You can and should change your mind.
That intellectual flexibility, that willingness to be slippery is something we are sorely missing today.
Absolutely. He showed us that a society without criticism, especially self-criticism, is a society that is dying. He wasn't afraid to stand alone if he thought he was right, even if it cost him his friends.
I want to leave the listener with a quote from Paz that really stuck with me during this research. He wrote, "There can be no society without poetry, but society can never be realized as poetry. Sometimes the two terms seek to break apart, they cannot."
That is the beautiful paradox of his life's work. Society is the structure, the rules, the prose. Poetry is the dream, the rebellion, the freedom. They are always in tension, but they need each other to survive.
So here is the question for you to mull over as you unplug today. In your own life, or in this fractured world we're all living in, what is the poetry that holds the structure together?
What is the thing that keeps the machine from crushing the human spirit?
That's the vital question. Thanks for diving deep with us.